and thanks for joining. I should start with an apology because this session was scheduled to be held last term, but unforeseen circumstances meant that we had to postpone. But the delay has been fortuitous because in the meantime, we've been awarded a grant of over £400,000 from the Livicum Trust. And so we're now a fully fledged project with our own logo. And what we'd like to do in this session is give you a taste of what we're doing and why and how we're doing it. And I'll start with the project team. Luisa Morales is a Spanish harpsichordist, musicologist, and director of FIMTE. She got her doctorate from the University of Melbourne for a thesis on Scarlatti's construction of a Spanish style. Marco Moiraghe is an Italian composer, performer, and conductor. He did his doctorate on Scarlatti's sacred vocal music and edited the esercizi for record his complete edition of Scarlatti's sonatas. JÉRÉMIE LUMBROSO gained his doctorate in Paris and now teaches computer science at Princeton University. He designed and built the platform our project is based on and is leading on data capture and analysis, and he's a lifelong Scarlatti enthusiast. Jasper van der Klis is a Dutch pianist, recently graduated from Guildhall with a doctoral thesis on Busoni's editions of Bach. And I'm a cultural historian specializing in early modern Spain. So you can see we're a diverse, international and multidisciplinary group, and we're supported by a larger team of volunteer citizen scientists that Jasper will say more about later. These two extracts are the opening and closing remarks of Joel Sheveloff's legendary two-part article published in the Musical Quarterly in 1985. You can see that he's pretty damning about the state of Scarlatti scholarship, particularly the almost complete lack of information about his life and career. But they also point to what we call the Scarlatti paradox, how to reconcile Scarlatti's enormous popularity with his almost total invisibility. With very few honorable exceptions, not a great deal has changed since Sheveloff's article. We still know almost nothing about Scarlatti's last 40 or so years in Portugal and Spain, other than that he taught the Infanta, later Queen Maria Barbara, during most of that time. He appears to have spent half his life in a royal music room in Madrid, yet his music went viral across the whole of Europe. How did that happen? Well, to tackle this question, we're focusing on the evidence that we do have, the sonatas themselves, and our objective is to carry out the first comprehensive and systematic study of all the surviving 18th century manuscript and printed copies of his keyboard sonatas. We need to know how they're related to each other and what they can tell us about composition, reception, and performance. And there are three main problems. The first is that there are an awful lot of them. 555 sonatas in Kirkpatrick's catalogue, plus upwards of 30 attributed and attributable extras. We're sticking with K numbers, by the way, but we will propose a supplement to his catalogue. And there are about 3,200 witnesses in around 100 volumes in more than 30 libraries and archives worldwide. And by the time we've collated all of these witnesses, we'll have a set of about 20 million data points, which is biggish by humanities standards. It's like having a jigsaw without the box, without the picture on the box, and with most of the pieces missing. The second problem is that three collections of sonatas in particular have dominated textual work on Scarlatti. These are the Esercizi per Cembalo, published in London in 1738-9, Kirkpatrick 1-30, and the two manuscript sets that Maria Barbara left to Farinelli in her will, and that are now in Venice and Parma. These three collections have impeccable provenance, so who wouldn't want to base their edition on them? Here you see the first 10 bars of K535 in the Parma manuscript. It's elegant to look at and easy to play from. But the problem is that EV and P, as we call them, account for less than a third of the total number of 18th century witnesses. What should we do with the other 2,000 or more? Many of these are not nearly so well manicured. This is the same passage from a Barcelona manuscript, and you can see poor penmanship, poor quality paper. It's crammed into the bottom of the page, much more difficult to play from, but I think much more like the kind of text that was in general circulation. And the third problem arises from what you've already seen. Almost without exception, Scarlatti sonatas are preserved in collections or compilations, and a compilation by definition is not a single text. So nothing we can say about any one piece in the collection can reliably be said about any other or about the collection as a whole. And in order to tackle these textual challenges, we're using variations on two established scientific techniques, philology and phylogenetics. Philology, like forensic science, is based on the idea that all contact involves transfer. You know, the blood in the car boot, the fibers on the body. And similarly, every time a text is copied, it's changed. And by comparing variants, it's possible to sort textual witnesses into families and generations. And this technique has traditionally been used in literary studies to reconstruct a lost archetype or all the text. Here you can see in the diagram that the witnesses at the bottom in the Roman letters are the ones that we have. And by comparing and contrasting, it's possible sometimes to reconstruct a hypothetical archetype here, given the Greek letter alpha. But as I suggested, this won't work for compilations, where a matrix approach would be more suitable. Well, we're not aiming to produce a new edition of Scarlatti, even though our work could be used by a future editor to do so. What we're trying to do is establish kinship as a way of mapping the circulation of Scarlatti's sonatas within Spain and across Europe. For this, we're using a form of phylogenetics. In biology, phylogenetics assumes difference and looks for identical strands of DNA to establish kinship. In textual studies, we start from the premise of identity, the premise that the copy and the original will be the same, but we look for differences that are common to more than one witness. And this calls for detailed bar by bar, note by note collation of all witnesses against a common baseline or control. It needs a high degree of accuracy and consistency and very smart data management. So what makes us think we can achieve this? As I've suggested, our success factors include, first, our interdisciplinary and practitioner-focused team, supported by a larger group of citizen scientists that give us many extra pairs of eyes and hands, hence the name Argos. Then there's access to JÉRÉMIE LUMBROSO's repository of digital images of the witnesses that we're working with, and the tailor-made Rosengrave tool for data capture, both of which he will talk about in a moment. And thirdly, the highly structured code that we've developed for recording variants that can be read by humans as well as computers. And Jasper will give you a preview of this later in the session. And we've carried out a successful proof of concept pilot on a manuscript with 37 sonatas and 140 collations. And we've just launched a second pilot on another manuscript with 101 sonatas and 372 collations. And now, of course, we have the missing ingredient, some cash. In conclusion, for my part of the presentation, I would say that our approach is empirical, and that's not always fashionable these days. I understand that. It's empirical and data-driven. It's comprehensive, systematic, and accessible. And we have a keen eye on future potential and the implications for performers. And Luisa will talk about this last bit to conclude our presentation. So that's all from me. So over to you, Jérémie.
Thank you very much, Barry. Let me share my screen. So just first, I'm a computer scientist here, and my other research colleagues are musicologists. So I just wanted to give just a brief overview of my perspective on this type of work. So I'm a computer scientist, and what I find appealing in research on Scarlatti, besides Scarlatti himself, are the questions of scale, having to do with how to approach a composer that is known only through his sonatas, all the scaling issues that arise from analyzing all of that data at once. There are questions of data management that are very appealing in computer science, which is how to manage all of this data that exists and that we are generating in this project. And then there are questions of community building, which is how to build focused community and scholarship around the composer, how to bring a critical mass of researchers together. So first, I would like to have you listen to the first few bars of a sonata. So that's the first few bars of the Sonata 533. And one of the things that is most distinctive about Scarlatti's style is the way he repeats small fragments of music. So here, this measure, this pattern here is repeated 3 times in K533. And there's a number of other patterns later on in the sonata that are repeated many times. So that was my entry point on Scarlatti's sonata in 2020. At Princeton University, the Center for Digital Humanities was making a call for proposal, and they were asking for questions having to do with digital humanities. What I wanted to do and what I was planning to do was to do a comprehensive study of those patterns I just showed you. The fact that the music in Scarlatti repeats in very unpredictable ways, so it's not always 2 times, it's sometimes 3 times or 7 times or 6 times. And that's something that's very distinctive about Scarlatti. Even some of his contemporaries like Soler or Albero that also use repetitions would often only repeat patterns a specific number of times, like 2 times. So I wanted to analyze the occurrence of patterns, and I felt as a computer scientist that somebody had already created a data set of Scarlatti, that I would just need to take that data set and run my own analysis. And in the process, I realized that very little of the data for Scarlatti is actually available. Most of the manuscripts were not available publicly. The Venice and Parma manuscript that Barry mentioned were available on the venerable IMSLP, but everything else was not to be found. And so I had to sideline this main project that I had and focus on the collection of the manuscripts. And just to show you, what I put together is a repository that aggregates, whose goal is to aggregate all data related to Scarlatti in open access. So currently we are trying to ensure that there is access to every manuscript ever discovered on Manuscript, every print ever except the Longo edition, which I think is disseminated well enough at this point, and also all the data sets that we are creating right now on Scarlatti. So just to come back to this example of what does it mean to index all of these manuscripts? Well, it means that for every manuscript of Scarlatti, we have the full high definition digitization, and then we have metadata that catalogs each one of the pages. So for each page of the manuscript, it indicates the Kirkpatrick index number, the local index number within the manuscript, the page start and end, and the memo. This allows us to create for every sonata a set of all of the correspondence across the manuscripts. So for instance, going back to K533, in the top here, you see the Gilbert edition, which we all use to perform. But then I've shown you excerpts from other manuscripts. And what's really interesting about these excerpts from the 6 other manuscripts, Parma, Venezia, the New York Carey manuscript, one of the Montserrat copies of the 533, the Cambridge manuscript in Barcelona, Orfeo, is you see just on this first line of music, you see discrepancies in the number of times each of these patterns has occurred. So in the reference copies of Parma and Venezia, they appear 3 times. But in copies of those manuscripts, you can see that the copyist sometimes dropped one of the occurrences of the pattern so that there are only 2 in some of them. And in one, Barcelona Orfeo, there's only 1 repetition of this pattern. So this is to illustrate visibly what Barry was saying about these small changes that happen between the manuscripts and that require that we encode all of these manuscripts and their differences to be able to track these small changes. So one of the things I would like to say is that our approach is necessary completist. You know, we're looking at every manuscript, we're trying to categorize every bar, we're trying to track every change. And there's a good tradition of completist approach in Scarlatti. So Kirkpatrick was a completist. He tried to index the whole catalog. He created the catalog that we have now. Shevelov indexed all of the sources and created these tables that we are still working on today. But there are other people, some have been celebrated and others not. So for instance, Christophe Rousset in 1985 created one of the most enlightening papers on Scarlatti called A Statistical Approach on the Sonatas. And he was able to establish the difficulty level and help us track the progression of difficulty among the texts, giving clues on the chronology. But other people, such as John Sankey, who has recorded all of the works, Christopher Hale, who's indexed them all, or the recent work of Celestino Yanez, who has revisited all of the sources. All of these people had the right idea, which is that to say anything that is worth being listened to on Scarlatti, you need to take a completist approach. You need to be curious about the discrepancies happening throughout the whole data set. And this is what the work that we are building on ourselves. So in addition to the data sets that we're producing, we're also producing specific tools. So for instance, we've built a tool called Bar Cutter that assists us in extracting every single bar as an image from all of the manuscripts. And we've also created a tool called Incipit, which extracts the lines of the manuscripts and of the edition such that they can be displayed in a thematic index. So as an example of what we can obtain when we are combining just some of our data sets, this is our searchable sonata catalog. It's a catalog of all of the sonatas of Domenico Scarlatti that can be searched by key, tempo, time signature. And so this is an example of how we can assemble our data set. So we have the data set from Kirkpatrick with the key, tempo, and time signature combined with the Gilbert edition, who itself has become a data set, and all of the links are available to the Gilbert edition, with the incipits created from the Gilbert edition. And all of this is combined for the convenience of performers and future researchers. Now, one of the tools that we've built, as Barry has mentioned, is called Rose Engrave. This was built by myself and my student, Joseph Liu. This is a tool that allows us to share with volunteers all of the manuscripts and to provide the volunteers with an interface in which to document bar by bar the differences between a control and the sonatas. So for between every control, which is usually the either published Etertisi or Venezia or Parma, these are the control sources, we compare them to the manuscripts that we've identified to be able to create the difference code between the control and manuscript. The goal of this is to eventually have the totality of all of the manuscripts and variants of Scarlatti encoded in a way that can be machine searchable and machine queryable to be able to do the experiments that Barry has mentioned on philology, which are the experiments that we are interested in. But it's also to make all of this publicly available for other researchers to build on and to do their own queries. So as such, we are setting the scene for a lot of research to take part. And finally, one of the last pieces of our work is to create a machine readable edition, which is not a new critical edition. It's just a machine readable version of the control. This will be done in Lily Pond. And with this Lily Pond edition in our machine diff code, we will have all of the variants encoded in a machine readable way. This part of the project is supported by Nicolas So, who has an immense amount of experience as edition Nicolas So, creating Lily Pond editions of Baroque manuscripts. So our overall deliverables is, first of all, our own research questions, which we are very passionate about. But one of the things that we're doing in contrast with previous work is we want all of our byproducts to be publicly available. Everything that we've had access to, we are going to make available to every researcher in the field. And the goal is to make it easier for all of us to do research and investigate more on Scarlatti. And finally, all of our tools that we are building, we are making sure that they will be available both for Scarlatti research and for future research in digital musicology of manuscripts. Thank you very much. So now I'm going to hand it off to Jasper, and Jasper is going to give you more detail on how the volunteers are affecting this work in Rosengrave with the spreadsheet.
Thank you, Jeremy. For my part of the presentation, I would like to start firstly by thanking the continued efforts of our citizen scientists, our volunteers. Our volunteers are all expertly trained musicians and researchers who studied at or are affiliated with leading conservatoires or other universities, such as the Guildhall School, the Royal Academy of Music here in London, the Juilliard School in New York, the Conservatorio Giuseppe Verdi in Milan in Italy, or the Utrecht Conservatoire in the Netherlands, just to name a few. And as you can see from the list of names, the countries and the pictures on the right-hand side of this slide, we are blessed with a truly international group of artists who all share a passion for Scarlatti's work. We are very happy to be working together with them on this project, and are always looking to expand our team to include more devotees of Scarlatti. The volunteers of the Argos team are such an important part of our process. And like the mythological giant Argos, who was said to have 100 eyes, they provide our team with up to an extra 50 pairs of eyes for collation, data entry, and double checking. Now, Barry has already mentioned the significant numbers for this project, the over 555 sonatas, over 3,200 manuscripts and printed witnesses spread worldwide, and the over 55,000 bars of music in the Kirkpatrick catalogue. That's an average of almost 100 bars per sonata. Now let's multiply those 55,000 bars by 5 or 6 collations on average per sonata, and you get a truly enormous amount of bars. And as I will explain later, all of these have to be checked at least once by a volunteer, at least once by a team member, and they then have to be validated by another team member. But before we talk about the workflow of the project, I will first explain how the team members and the volunteers record the information we find important using our Rosengrave software and our original notation system. And I will then end with a complex example from one of our pilots, the Barcelona MS 1964 pilot. Undoubtedly, the most important part of our spreadsheet, which Jeremy has just shown you a little bit from, is the bar section, which consists of one row for each bar in the control for every witness. Now, while the cells in this section of the spreadsheet are free text, we devised a notation system, which is understandable, as Barry has said, to humans and computers alike. For pitch notation, we adhere to the Lily Pond pitch conventions. The Lily Pond is free, text-based music engraving software, which produces high-quality sheet music, uses lowercase letters, commas, and single quotation marks or apostrophes to indicate all the notes on the keyboard. Note values are then indicated with numbers, 2 for a minimum or half note, 4 for a crotchet or quarter note, and so on. C2 thus stands for a minim C, 1 octave below middle C. D sharp apostrophe apostrophe 4 stands for a crotchet D sharp, an octave above middle C, and E flat apostrophe apostrophe 8 dot stands for a dotted quaver E flat, an octave above middle C. Grace notes, trills, and other ornaments are indicated by abbreviations to limit the amount of keystrokes required. An appoggiatura, for instance, is written as APP. An acciaccatura or slashed grace note is written as ACC, and a trill is written as TR. Now, the table in the bottom right corner is a cut from our user manual, which shows an example of each. There are a few steps one should follow to use our notation system to accurately record a difference between a control or a baseline text and a witness. Firstly, one has to identify the relevant note in the control text by counting the notes from the beginning of the bar, irrespective of voice, stave, or hands. And there are a couple of rules to keep in mind here. We treat ornaments as part of the main note, tight notes as two separate notes, and we include rests as if they were notes. Effectively, we aim to record each separate vertical sound event in a bar. Now, sometimes this vertical alignment may not be clear, as we can see in the image on the slide. In these cases, we can consult Kenneth Gilbert's performance edition. Once we have established the note by its relative position in the bar, we specify its pitch. And this is done to distinguish between the 4 notes at position 1, the 3 notes at position 3. Remember, tight notes count as separate notes, and so on. Once we have identified this note to which the variant applies, the variant can then be recorded in one of our predefined formats. After selecting the bar in which the variant occurs, we enter the pitch, followed by a closing square bracket, followed by a space, which is then followed by the reading in the witness. And some examples are given in the table. For instance, the first example tells us that the 9th note in the bar, which is a middle C in the control, is an octave higher in this witness. The second example tells us that the C on position 9 is not present in the witness, and so on. If there is more than one variant in the bar, we record each variant separately by entering a semicolon between spaces. Now, this promotes not only legibility, but also makes the input easier to understand for the computer and easier searchable. Our team members and volunteers all have access to an online user manual, which gives examples of the most common variants encountered, as well as guidance on how to correctly input the desired notation. And through our interaction with our volunteers during our pilot in the summer of 2022, we managed to refine our notation system significantly. It is now more efficient, it requires fewer keystrokes, and it captures the information we believe to be most important with greater precision. I'll talk a little bit about the workflow of our project. Each volunteer is assigned an individual sheet in which they use our notation system to indicate all the variants they can find between the sources. A team member concurrently works on the same group of sonatas independently. Once this work has been completed, Rosengrave merges these two data sets together and then tasks a different team member with checking the two versions against each other. And this final check is then extracted once more to create a main spreadsheet for each sonata. And through this workflow, we maintain a high level of accuracy and ensure that nothing slips past unseen. At the bottom of this slide, I've included an example of a completed bar section. Note that many of the boxes are empty. And this is to be expected since these are all copies of the same work, and they should, in principle, all be the same. And finally, the notes section on the right-hand side of the sheet may be used to draw further attention to bar-specific issues. For instance, I have noted here that I have made several assumptions in my collation process, which my colleagues may then agree or disagree with in the checking process. Now, I'd like to offer one example of a complex variant between two copies of the same sonata, K109. While a human would look at the differences between these 3 bars here, between Venezia and Cari, and simply conclude that the bottom and top lines have been transposed down an octave in Cari, our notation system is not as easy, or not as lenient rather. The proper notation, which captures all the variants in these 3 bars, requires over 400 keystrokes. a feat accomplished successfully not only by our team members, but also by 2 independent volunteers. And the full notation for these bars can be seen in the example below. Note that every single note has to be accounted for, and that all these variants have to be separated by a semicolon. The keystrokes surely add up quickly this way, but ultimately it is legible and understandable both to a human as well as to a machine. Now, looking at these examples together with other variants found in this Carey manuscript, we could hypothesize that the work was adapted for a keyboard which did not have a high D. And this note can be seen multiple times in Venezia, as well as other copies, but it's constantly avoided in Carey. Now, this is why the octave transposition may have been necessary in these bars. Now, while all of our volunteers are, of course, professional musicians of exceptional skill, they have no prior experience with our notation system, yet managed to use it with great expertise over the course of a few weeks. And some of them were so keen for more work that we have expanded our Rosengrave software to include the possibility of allocating work on demand. Once a volunteer or team member completes their allocated work, they can request another sonata to start on. And this allows us not only to recognize and reward high-performing volunteers, it also provides us with important data to accurately plan the separate phases of our project. The work done during our first pilot on the Barcelona M1964 manuscript has already shown interesting kinships between various copies. Yet again, we have to keep in mind that the complete Scarlatti sonatas in Kirkpatrick's catalogue contain over 55,000 bars. So there is still plenty of work to be done. And almost all of the volunteers on the Barcelona pilot will be joining us again. But as I said, we are recruiting more people for the next phases of our project, and we are looking forward to our continued cooperation. And now I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Luisa, who will tell us more about the research into practice.
Thank you, Jasper. One of the main aims of our project, Texting Scarlatti, is to place musical performance at the center of musicological study, in line with the methodological and conceptual renewal of performance studies. This paradigm shift, defined by Nicholas Cook as a performative turn in 21st century recital practice, implies to understand music as performance, as an act, instead of a fixed text. From this new perspective, the Urtext edition as the model for a historically informed performance becomes a limited practice. Musical performance as an object of study implies a comprehensive approach to the textual and contextual evidence, the consideration of specific geographic and cultural areas, the venues and the uses of music for specific circumstances. In this vein, Domenico Scarlatti is to be viewed not only as a generator or a producer of scores, but as a performer who improvised and lived in an ecosystem where changes, variations in music were common, where the concept of a fixed and mutable text as an ultimate closed piece of work was unknown. This concept, the closed work of music, is an anachronic approach strongly related to the evolution during the 20th century of phonography and its technology, which has dramatically changed the way we listen to and perform music. In our research project, Testing Scarlatti, we have a holistic approach to the score. We see the score as a piece of information on the diversity of past performance practices, with the potential of producing in its turn a diversity of present and future performances of Domenico Scarlatti sonatas. Next, okay, that's good. In the first phase of our research, we have found for a single sonata up to 8 sources dated in the 18th century, for instance, for Kirkpatrick K19. As previously explained by my colleagues, when collating the copies, we found multiple variants on the notation, thus comprising ornamentation, range, pitch, rhythm, repetitions of fragments, and even on the sonata titles. At a first glance, most of these variants could be seen as inaccuracies or mistakes made by the copyists. But after examining them with our magnifying glass, the Rosengrave tool, our eyes are exposed to different and new readings, and certainly we are able to detect intentional alterations. In our research, we establish a control source as a point of departure for collations, establishing then a dialogue with every single sonata from other 18th century collections. We have then created a header with 21 entries. Next, please, Jasper. Yes, you have on the left column this part of these entries where we give a general description of a given sonata. That's it. Title, tempo, clefs, key signature, time signature, number of bars for each part of the sonata, compass, hand signs, ending signs, articulation signs, dynamic signs, and the different types of ornaments. For example, one of the first remarks we usually make on the header is the compass or range of the sonata. Next, please. As it helps to ascertain the type of instrument, harpsichord, fortepiano, or organ at disposal. For a given sonata, the range may change. Some copies avoid the highest and lowest notes, pointing to instruments with a short octave, from C to C or from C to D, like the harpsichord Joseph Bueno you have on the screen, or the Salvador Gofri, made in Barcelona in 1743. Some other sonatas give a range from 4 octaves and a half, like the Francisco Pérez de Miral fortepiano, now in Mallorca, dated in 1745. Some others give the G to G, etc. So some sonatas really can be interpreted looking at the manuscript and to the instruments, harpsichords, and fortepianos and organs that were at the disposal in local areas. There is an example, next please, with Sonata Kirkpatrick 471 in Venezia, is in volume number 13. The sonata ranges from G to G, from the G low to the highest G. And when the sonata was copied in the convent San Pedro de las Dueñas in León in 1769, not only this manuscript avoids the top G, but changes the end of the sonata. Scarlatti sonatas widely circulated in Spanish convents and monasteries during the second half of the 18th century. Copied by nuns in their personal notebooks, sonatas were adapted not only to the compass of the keyboard instruments on display, and I include here the organ, but on the occasion and venue to be played. In this vein, the omission or addition of repetitions may obey, perhaps, to some circumstances, like the sonata being included as a part of the mass. Ornamentation is a sensitive matter too, as it shows not only different performances, but different writing traditions and tastes, depending on the geographic area and the time. As an example, can you change the slide? That's good. I think that's the last one. As an example, we can look at the sonata number 4 for the Serchizzi, also transmitted by several 18th century sources, including the manuscripts at the Bibliothèque de l'Arsenal in Paris, L'Orfeo Català, Barcelona, and the publication Pièces choisies by Madame Boivin in Paris. They are all authoritative and very closely dated, but the variants they present have strong implications for performance. Different sources present this polyphonic writing with different treatments of counterpoint, minimal shifts or divergences in pitch, and different uses of rests. There are more embellishments in Boivin's score than in the other sources, showing a French taste or style backed up by the title, Allemande instead of Allegro, like in the Serchizzi. But no version is better or more preferable than another. All these cultural adaptations of the sonatas speak on everyday performers' practices, and we think it's a field worth exploring to open new perspectives, not only on specific performance issues, but new ways of programming Scarlatti sonatas. To conclude, by taking a comprehensive approach to the textual and contextual evidence, we can give performers greater agency as access to the full range of interpretative options open to them when they decide which pieces to play, how to play them, in which combinations, on which instruments, and on the basis of which texts. Thank you.
Thank you, Luisa, and thank you to the whole team.